The crowd gathered before sunrise, drawn by whispers of what would soon unfold. Farmers left their fields, merchants abandoned their stalls, and even children clung to their mothers' hands, pulled along by curiosity stronger than fear. By the time the first church bells rang, the square was full. People pressed shoulder to shoulder, their breath rising in the cold air. All of them waited to see the same thing, the fall of a man who had once ruled them through terror. At the center of the square stood a tall wooden scaffold, rough planks nailed together in haste but strong enough to carry the weight of both a man and his doom. Above it hung ropes, iron hooks, and the black stains of past deaths. Yet the execution that would take place today was unlike anything the people had seen before. This was not to be a quick killing. It was to be a message carved into flesh and memory, a warning that would echo long after the man's last breath. The prisoner was brought forward at noon. Shackled, stripped, and half-dragged through the streets, he no longer looked like the noble who once sat beside kings. His face was pale, his lips cracked, and his eyes darted wildly from side to side, searching the crowd for a trace of mercy he would never find. The people jeered, shouting curses, hurling rotten food, and spitting as he passed. For years he had stood above them, untouchable, his word law, his greed endless. Now he stumbled in the dirt, weak and trembling, every step crushing what remained of his dignity. The air was thick with expectation. This was not an ordinary execution, it was theater. The Queen herself had chosen the place and the method, making certain that every detail carried meaning. Every rope, every knife, every word spoken was meant to strip away not just the man's life, but the very idea that he had ever mattered. His death would not be private. It would not be silent. It would be slow, painful, and unforgettable. When he reached the scaffold, the guards forced him to kneel. The charges were read aloud, each word cutting deeper than the ropes that bound him. Treason, theft, corruption, betrayal of crown and country. With every crime spoken, the crowd roared, their voices rolling like thunder. The man flinched at the sound. Once he had silenced entire courts with a glance. Now he could not even silence the voices of farmers and beggars. The executioner stepped forward, face hidden beneath a hood, carrying the tools of his trade. The man tried to speak, his voice hoarse, broken by fear. No one listened. His words were drowned by the jeers of the people and the crack of drums that beat a slow, steady rhythm. The sound was not for him alone, it was for everyone watching, a reminder that justice, once delayed, had finally arrived. The first stage was humiliation. The prisoner was stripped naked, his body exposed to the crowd. Laughter rippled through the square. To be seen so powerless, so small, was worse than any wound. The man shook, not from the cold but from the weight of shame crushing him. He was no longer a lord, no longer a ruler. He was flesh waiting to be unmade. Then came the dragging. Tied behind a horse, he was pulled through the mud and filth of the streets, his body battered against stones. The crowd followed, shouting, throwing refuse, singing mocking songs that turned his name into a curse. By the time he was hauled back to the scaffold, he was barely conscious, his skin torn, his mouth filled with blood. Yet still the true punishment had not begun. The Queen's messengers had spread word far and wide that this death would be unlike any before. And so the people waited. Mothers held their children high on their shoulders so they would remember. Men craned their necks, eager to see cruelty dressed as justice. For all of them knew this was more than the end of a man. It was the end of an era. The prisoner was lifted onto the scaffold once more. His eyes, once sharp and filled with pride, were wide with terror. He begged, though no one could hear him over the cheers. The executioner placed the rope around his neck, pulled it tight, and raised him high above the crowd. He kicked and choked, face purple, gasping for air. But the rope was measured with care, not enough to kill, only enough to torment. His body shook like a broken puppet, every twitch a reminder of his helplessness. When he was cut down, still alive, the crowd erupted in a roar. Some shouted for mercy, but their voices were drowned by the majority who demanded more, and more was promised. The execution was not yet finished. It had barely begun. What happened next would strip away not only his life, but his very identity. Every act of cruelty was chosen to erase who he was. A noble, a ruler, a man. Piece by piece, the executioners would destroy him, turning his body into a stage upon which the kingdom declared its revenge. This was not justice in the way of laws and courts. This was justice in the way of power and vengeance, a warning carved into blood and bone. The prisoner's cries, The crowd's laughter and the steady hands of the executioners combined into one chilling truth. This was not simply an ending. It was a performance, and every person present, queen, noble, farmer, child, was part of the audience. Together they witnessed the unmaking of a man who had once believed himself untouchable. Together they learned the message that power without mercy leads only to ruin. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the square seemed to hold its breath. Everyone knew the final act would come soon. Everyone knew they would leave with the image of this death burned forever into memory. The man who once ruled from shadows now stood in the full light of day, broken and stripped of everything, awaiting the last blow. His story was almost over. But the meaning of his death, his performance of downfall, was only beginning. The execution was not only about punishing one man. It was about protecting a kingdom. The crowd that filled the square knew this truth, even if they did not speak it aloud. They understood that what happened on that scaffold would decide more than a single life. It would decide the shape of their future. For years the man had ruled from the shadows, bending the crown to his will. His word was stronger than laws, his greed greater than reason. Nobles feared him, the church despised him, and even the queen herself had been silenced by his hand. If he had lived, the kingdom would have remained in his grasp. And if that had happened, no family, no church, no noble house would have been safe. His survival meant their ruin. His death meant their chance at freedom. That was why the punishment had to be so cruel. A simple hanging would not have been enough. A clean sword stroke would not have satisfied the rage boiling through the land. This execution was designed to erase the fear he had planted in every corner of England. Only when the people saw him broken, mocked and destroyed could they believe he was gone forever. The stakes were written in every eye watching the scaffold. Farmers wanted justice for their stolen harvests. Merchants wanted revenge for the gold taken through false charges. Lords wanted the return of their lands torn from them under threats and tricks of law. Wives wanted vengeance for the humiliation of being used as pawns. Bishops wanted to prove that the church could not be crushed forever. Every group in the kingdom carried its own wound, and all those wounds had the same face. The queen and her allies also knew the danger. This was not only about revenge. It was about showing every future ruler, every future favorite, what would happen if one man tried to make himself stronger than the crown itself. If he had been allowed to live, even in exile, his name would have lingered like a shadow, a reminder of the years when fear ruled instead of law. But dead, publicly, brutally, and without mercy, he became a warning no one could ignore. The execution was, in truth, the foundation of a new order. With every cut of the knife, with every roar of the crowd, a message was carved into history. No man could rise so high without falling even harder. Power could be borrowed from kings, stolen from nobles, and forced from the church, but it could never outlast the anger of the people. His death proved that, and yet the stakes were heavier still. For the queen, this was not only the destruction of an enemy, it was the saving of her own life. For years she had lived under his control, her household stripped, her voice silenced. Her children had been threatened, her title mocked. If he had kept his place beside the king, she would have remained a prisoner in her own palace. The scaffold was not only his end, it was her freedom. For the nobles who had bent under his cruelty, the stakes were survival. If he had escaped, he would have returned with greater wrath. They had seen how he dealt with enemies before. Land stolen, families torn apart, men dragged through false courts until their names were ashes. The execution was their shield against that fate. For the common people, the stakes were simpler but no less vital. They wanted proof that even the mighty could bleed. They wanted to believe that their prayers for justice had been answered. If this man could be destroyed, then perhaps others who abused their power might one day fall as well. The scaffold was not just about him, it was about hope, rough and bloody though it was. And for history itself, the stakes reached even further. His punishment would set a model that lasted for centuries. It would become the shape of treason's fate, copied again and again when others dared to betray crown and country. What happened in that square was not only a moment of revenge, it was the birth of a tradition of terror dressed as justice. The queen's advisors had spoken of this quietly before the execution. They said, "If we do not destroy him completely, another will rise to take his place." That was the true risk. Tyrants breed tyrants, and weakness at the throne invites new predators. The only way to guard against this was to make the punishment unforgettable. to make it so savage that no one would dare follow the same path. So the stakes stretched across the kingdom like invisible chains. One man's life carried the weight of thousands of others. One man's death would decide whether the people lived under fear or under law. To some, he was just a villain meeting his end. But to the queen, the nobles, the people, and even foreign rulers watching from afar, he was the symbol of everything wrong with power left unchecked. If he had not been punished, the kingdom might have slid deeper into chaos. If he had not been humiliated, others would have learned nothing. If he had not been destroyed completely, his shadow would have remained. That was the fear. That was the risk, and that was why the crowd shouted for more when the rope tightened but did not kill. Because they knew this was not about one man dying. It was about protecting a nation from ever falling into his grip again. It was about turning the horror of his cruelty into a shield against future tyrants. His life was already lost the moment he was captured. What mattered now was what his death would mean, and so the stakes were set. His execution was not only the end of a reign of terror, it was the beginning of a warning that would echo through centuries. Long before the scaffold, long before the jeers of the crowd, he was simply a boy with a name carried by his father. Born into the late 13th century, Hugh was not yet destined for greatness. His family was noble, yes, but not among the greatest of houses. They were respected yet not feared. His father, Hugh the Elder, had already carved a place at court through clever words and loyalty to the crown. The younger Hugh inherited this foundation, along with something sharper. A hunger that would never be satisfied. The world he entered was unstable. The great Edward the Fern, the Hammer of the Scots, had died in 1307, leaving his son Edward II on the throne. Where the father had been hard, commanding, and feared, the son was softer, more distracted, and far too easily swayed by those who whispered closest to his ear. It was a dangerous weakness for a king to show, but for men like Hugh it was an open door. At first, Hugh was just another courtier, clever and ambitious, but not yet remarkable. He played the role of loyal servant, speaking carefully, listening more than others, never drawing too much attention. But he watched. He studied. He saw how the king leaned toward favorites, men who provided not just counsel but companionship. The first of these was Piers Gaveston, a man who flaunted his influence and angered every noble in England. Hugh learned from watching him. He saw that power could be gained by closeness to the king, but he also saw how dangerous it was to flaunt that power too openly. When Gaveston was murdered by enraged nobles, the throne was left without a shield, and Edward without a companion. Into that silence stepped Hugh. He offered not only loyalty but a different kind of strength. Unlike Gaveston, Hugh was English-born, connected to noble families and skilled in the language of law and politics. Where Gaveston had taunted the lords, Hugh offered them legal papers. Where Gaveston had sought jewels and titles, Hugh sought control. It began with small steps. A favor here, a clever piece of advice there. The king listened, perhaps because Hugh said the words others feared to say, or perhaps because the king desired more than advice from him. Whispers spread quickly, whispers of closeness, of affection, of a bond stronger than mere politics. Whatever the truth, Edward trusted him, and that trust became the root of Hugh's rise. By 1318, Hugh had entered the king's inner circle. He became Chamberlain, a title that gave him constant access to Edward day and night. This was more than a position, it was a key. It allowed him to filter who reached the king, what messages the king heard, and how decisions were shaped. Bit by bit, he built a wall around the monarch, a wall only he controlled. Ambition burned within him. Others sought titles and lands, but Hugh wanted something larger. He wanted to be the voice of the crown itself. To him, the king was not a master, but a vessel through which he could rule. Every petition, every decree, every judgment passed through his hands. The nobles soon realized that to reach the king, they first had to bend to Hugh, but his rise was not fueled by position alone. He was ruthless in ways that others were not. He understood that fear was a sharper weapon than loyalty. He identified rivals and stripped them piece by piece. Lands were seized on flimsy charges, families ruined through fabricated trials, and rebels executed in public to send a message. The lords of the Welsh marches were among his first targets. Their lands were rich, their power old, and their pride great. Hugh crushed them through a mix of violence and law, claiming their estates until he ruled the borderlands as if he were king in all but name. Each victory fed his hunger. Each fallen rival strengthened his grip. The people whispered that he was not only the king's companion but his master, his shadow the one who pulled the strings. And perhaps deep down Hugh began to believe it himself. But ambition has its cost. Every step upward created new enemies. The lords who had once tolerated him grew restless. The queen herself found her power shrinking as Hugh blocked her path to her husband. Even the church felt his hand, as bishops were imprisoned and church lands taken. Yet Hugh pressed forward, convinced that his position was untouchable. By 1324, he had reached the height of his influence. He was no longer just Chamberlain, he was the true ruler of England. Foreign envoys knew that an audience with the king meant nothing unless Hugh was present. Parliament bent under his will. The treasury swelled with lands and riches seized in his name. He was feared by nobles, hated by the queen, and despised by the people. But fear, he believed, was power, and as long as the king stood at his side, that power would last forever. Yet hidden in his rise were the seeds of his destruction. His cruelty left no corner of England untouched and every victim remembered. His arrogance blinded him to the growing storm gathering across the Channel, where the Queen plotted her return. He believed himself above danger, untouchable, as if he could rise higher and higher without ever falling. But history does not forgive such pride. The same hunger that had lifted him up would soon drag him down. His rise was complete. The fall was waiting. By the time Hugh stood at the height of his power, England no longer felt like the kingdom of Edward II. It felt like the kingdom of Hugh Despenser. The king's seal still appeared on documents. His name still declared laws, but everyone knew whose hand truly guided the crown. Courtiers whispered it. Foreign rulers reported it. Even the common people in the markets and fields said it aloud. The favorite ruled and the king obeyed. Power like that should have brought stability, but in Hugh's grip, it became terror. He had learned long ago that fear was more reliable than friendship, and he applied this lesson without hesitation. Nobles who dared question him soon discovered what it meant to defy the shadow ruler. Their estates were seized under claims of treason. Their families were imprisoned, stripped of wealth, or forced into marriages that served his designs. Their names were dragged through false trials until they became nothing more than disgraced echoes. The Marcher lords, those proud rulers of the borderlands, suffered most. Hugh coveted their lands, and one by one, he found reasons to destroy them. Some he accused of rebellion, others of theft, others still of disloyalty to the crown. In truth, the charges mattered little. What mattered was the outcome, their downfall and his gain. The Marches became his fortress of wealth, feeding his coffers and tightening his hold on the king. What made his rule different from tyrants before him was not only his greed, but his clever use of law. He did not simply steal. He drafted documents, forced parliaments, and bent courts until his theft appeared legal. On parchment, his crimes were covered in the ink of legitimacy. To his victims, this was worse than robbery. It was humiliation, for they had no defense against his twisting of the very laws that were meant to protect them. Fear spread beyond the nobility. The church itself trembled beneath his hand. Bishops who criticized royal policy found themselves arrested. Monasteries lost lands that had been theirs for generations. Even sacred figures were not safe. Bishop Adam of Hereford, respected and pious, was imprisoned and tortured for daring to raise his voice against Hugh. Such acts shocked the faithful. To strike against the church was to strike against God, and yet Hugh did it without hesitation. Women suffered in ways most did not dare speak aloud. Daughters of nobles were forced into marriages that benefited his allies. Widows were cornered, their lands seized under legal tricks. Lady Alice de Lacy, one of the wealthiest women in England, was taken under Hugh's control like a prisoner. Her estates managed as if they were his own. These acts broke not only families, but the ancient codes of chivalry that once gave noble women some measure of safety. Even in a brutal age, his cruelty toward women stood out as something darker. The common people, too, felt his shadow. Farmers were taxed beyond endurance to feed his ambitions. Merchants saw their trade disrupted as Hugh seized goods in the name of the king. No one was beyond his reach. Spies whispered in taverns, servants carried secrets from noble halls, clerks in offices reported back to him. Every corner of the kingdom seemed to belong to his network. No conversation was safe. No alliance could be trusted. Paranoia became the air England breathed. But perhaps the cruelest weapon he wielded was humiliation. Death alone was too simple. When an enemy fell, Hugh made sure the destruction went deeper. Men were dragged before courts filled with lies, forced to confess crimes they had not committed and then executed as traitors. Their families watched their names destroyed, their dignity stolen, their bloodline stained forever. Hugh understood that breaking the spirit was more powerful than spilling blood. The execution of the Earl of Lancaster in 1322 revealed this truth. Lancaster was not only a noble but also a cousin of the king himself. His rebellion against Hugh's dominance ended in defeat, and Hugh ensured his punishment sent shockwaves through England. Executing a man of royal blood was no small matter. It told every noble in the land that pedigree offered no shield. If a cousin to the king could fall, then any of them could be next. Fear, sharp and cold, settled deeper into their hearts. Inside the royal palace, Hugh's influence grew more suffocating. The Queen Isabella found herself reduced to a shadow. Her income was cut, her household dismissed, her access to the king blocked. Hugh treated her not as a queen but as an inconvenience, a rival to be humiliated. It was an insult she would never forget, and one day she would repay it. Foreign rulers also saw the change. Ambassadors reported home that meeting Edward II was meaningless if Hugh was not present. Real negotiations happened only in private, behind closed doors where the favorite dictated terms. To other courts in Europe, England looked less like a kingdom ruled by a king and more like a kingdom ruled by his shadow. Hugh's reign of terror lasted years. It seemed endless, as though he had bound the kingdom in chains too strong to break. He had silenced nobles, bent the church, crushed the queen, and cowed the people. He believed himself untouchable, as if the crown itself had become his armor. But power built on fear is a fragile throne. Every act of cruelty left scars. Every victim remembered. And beyond the seas in France, a queen was waiting, gathering strength, ready to strike. Hugh did not see the storm rising. Or perhaps he did, but arrogance blinded him. He thought fear would hold his enemies in check forever. He thought law, twisted and reshaped, would protect him. He thought the king's love or loyalty or dependence would shield him from the rage of a nation. But fear has a limit. Even terror has a breaking point. And in the shadows of his tyranny, that breaking point was already being born. While Hugh ruled with an iron hand, plotting and seizing as if no one could touch him, in silence his enemies began to gather. Fear had kept them low for years, but fear, like fire, eventually burns out. In its place came rage, and with rage came resolve. And at the center of that resolve stood a woman whom Hugh had humiliated more than anyone else. The queen herself, Isabella of France. She was no ordinary queen. Born the daughter of a French king, raised in courts where politics were as dangerous as swords, Isabella had learned patience, strategy, and the power of appearances. When she first came to England, she had tried to be the loyal wife, the peacemaker between nobles and crown. But Hugh had stripped her power, mocked her household, and cut her off from her husband. To Hugh, she was not a queen but an obstacle. To Isabella, he was not simply an enemy, he was the thief of her crown, her honor, and her children's future. Her chance came in 1325. Edward II sent her to France as a negotiator, trusting that she would not betray him. Hugh did not see the danger in letting her leave England. But the moment she stepped onto French soil, Isabella was free. No longer chained by Hugh's spies, no longer silenced by his grip on the king, she could finally speak. And she spoke with fire. She told her brother, King Charles IV of France, that she was a queen wronged, stripped of her rights by the unnatural power of a single man. She told exiled English nobles, men driven from their homes by Hugh's cruelty, that together they could reclaim their land and honor. She told the church that she fought not for herself, but for the laws of God that Hugh had broken. With every word, she shaped herself into the image of justice. But words alone were not enough. She needed a sword at her side, a commander with courage and skill to match her will. She found him in Roger Mortimer, one of the Marcher lords Hugh had once hunted and forced into exile. Mortimer had escaped prison and fled across the sea, nursing a hatred as deep as Isabella's. Together they became more than allies. They became a force. Some whispered of love between them, but whether lovers or partners, their bond was unbreakable, forged in shared fury and ambition. From the castles of France they began to weave their web. Exiles flocked to them. Knights who had lost their estates, lords who had seen their families ruined, priests who had tasted Hugh's cruelty. Merchants offered gold, sailors promised ships, even common men volunteered to fight. Hugh's reign of terror had created his own army of enemies, and Isabella gave them a banner. Her message was simple and sharp. She told the people she did not come to destroy her husband the king. She came to save him from the corruption of a wicked favorite. She promised not vengeance but restoration, not chaos but order, and the people believed her, because they wanted to believe that their suffering could end. By 1326, the storm was ready. Isabella and Mortimer gathered a small invasion force, so small that many believed it would fail before it even reached England. Yet when their ships touched the English coast in September, something remarkable happened. Instead of resistance, they were greeted with cheers. Villagers welcomed them as liberators. Nobles who had pretended loyalty to Hugh rushed to join their ranks. Even men who had once feared to whisper against the favorite now marched under Isabella's banner. The tide had turned. Hugh's web of fear, which had seemed so strong, dissolved like smoke. The lords of England, who had bowed their heads for years, now lifted them high, knowing the Queen carried the will of the people. The army that should have defended Edward and Hugh melted away, choosing survival over loyalty. As Isabella's force grew, Hugh and the king fled westward, hoping to reach Wales, where Hugh's power was strongest. But even in the marches where he had ruled like a tyrant, the ground shifted beneath him. The same lords he had crushed remembered their suffering and chose the Queen instead. Gates that should have been closed opened at her approach. Strongholds that should have resisted surrendered without a fight. Hugh's enemies had waited years for this moment, and now their patience was rewarded. The fall was swift. Hugh's father, the elder Despenser, was captured first. His execution was brutal, meant to whet the appetite of a people hungry for vengeance. But all knew the true prize was still at large, the younger Despenser, the man who had ruled through cruelty and fear. By November, he too was caught, dragged from hiding like a rat from its hole. Broken, trembling, and desperate, he begged for mercy. None was given. His enemies, led by Isabella, would not allow him to escape through exile or negotiation. His death had already been written in the hearts of those who suffered. The opposition that destroyed him had not been born in a single day. It had been carved from years of pain, built upon the courage of a queen scorned, fueled by the rage of nobles ruined, and carried forward by the hope of a people who wanted their kingdom back. When Hugh was finally placed in chains, the square of Hereford waiting for his execution, the story of his rise was finished. Now the story of his destruction was ready to begin, and it was a story the whole kingdom would remember. When Hugh was finally caught in November 1326, the shadow ruler of England no longer looked like the man who had bent nobles and kings to his will. He was thin, exhausted, and trembling, his eyes hollow from weeks of flight. He had tried to flee to Wales, hoping the lands he once ruled like a tyrant might shelter him. But even there the tide had turned. Lords who once bowed to him now betrayed him, eager to offer his broken body to the queen he had mocked. Dragged in chains, he was carried toward Hereford, the very heart of the marches he had stolen piece by piece. The choice of place was no accident. This was where his power had been strongest, and it was also the seat of Bishop Adam of Hereford, a man he had once imprisoned and tortured. Now Hugh would face his end on the same soil he had stained with cruelty. The city prepared itself like a theater awaiting its most infamous play. The scaffold was built high, towering above the square so no eye could miss what would happen there. People poured into the city from every corner of the countryside. Peasants, merchants, lords, even priests. They did not come in silence. They came with laughter, with songs mocking his name, with the kind of hunger that only years of suffering could create. There would be no trial. The charges were read, not to determine guilt but to remind the crowd of the man's sins: treason, theft, cruelty, sacrilege, the corruption of a king. Each accusation was met with cheers. For once, the voices that had been silenced by Hugh now drowned him completely. He tried to speak, but his words broke apart in his throat, lost under the roar of thousands. Then the performance began. He was stripped naked, exposed before the crowd, his body pale and weak. For a man who once cloaked himself in fine robes and armor, the humiliation was deliberate. He was no longer lord or ruler. He was just flesh to be broken. The people jeered, some throwing filth, others chanting verses mocking his closeness to the king. His shame was the first stage of his punishment. Next came the dragging. Bound behind a horse, Hugh was pulled through the streets of Hereford. Stones bruised him, mud covered him, refuse stuck to his skin. By the time he was brought back to the scaffold, his body was battered, his face bloodied, his strength almost gone. But this was not meant to end quickly. His torment had only begun. On the scaffold, the rope was tied around his neck. The executioners were careful, too careful. They raised him until his feet kicked the air, his face turned purple, his body convulsed. But they did not let him die. At the edge of death, they cut him down. The crowd roared as he gasped for breath, each choking sound a reminder of the power now turned against him. Then came the act that turned punishment into symbol. Before the crowd, the executioners castrated him, casting the severed flesh into a fire. It was not only cruelty. It was a deliberate insult, meant to erase the bond he had shared with Edward II, a bond that many whispered was unnatural. The crowd cheered as the fire consumed the last proof of his manhood. His identity as a noble, as a ruler, even as a man, was stripped away piece by piece. Still alive, still conscious, he was laid upon the scaffold for the next act. His belly was cut open, his entrails drawn out slowly, each tug a performance for the eyes of thousands. Smoke rose as his organs were cast into the flames. His heart, the seat of loyalty and love, was torn from his chest and burned before him, a symbolic destruction of the affections that had corrupted the crown. Through it all, his screams tore the air, but the crowd only shouted louder, drowning him as they had once been drowned by his power. At last came the quartering. His limbs were tied to 4 horses, each straining at the ropes. With a final command, they pulled, ripping him apart in a spray of blood and bone. His head was severed and sent to London Bridge, placed alongside his father's as a grim warning. The pieces of his body were carried to other cities, scattered across England so that no one could forget. The square erupted in celebration. Some sang, others danced, some wept from the release of long-held rage. For them, this was not only an execution, it was a festival of justice. Their oppressor was gone, destroyed so completely that even memory seemed burned away. But for the Queen, it was more than vengeance. It was proof of her triumph, the symbol of a kingdom cleansed of its shadow. Edward II was forced to abdicate soon after, his crown placed upon the head of his young son, Edward III. The narrative was clear. The kingdom had been saved from the corruption of evil counsel, and justice had been served. Yet beneath the celebration lingered a darker truth. The cruelty of Hugh's death was so great, so detailed, that it left its own scar upon England. For generations, courtiers and favorites remembered the scaffold at Hereford whenever they sought too much power. His destruction became a warning etched into the very laws of treason, a pattern of punishment that would echo for centuries. That November day was not simply the end of a man. It was the birth of a legend, a tale of ambition, terror, and downfall so complete that even time could not erase it. And though his body was torn apart, the memory of his execution endured, whispered across taverns, written in chronicles, and carried in the minds of all who had watched. The shadow ruler had been unmade, but the shadow of his death would live on. When the last piece of Hugh's body was carried away, England exhaled as though a storm had passed. The people of Hereford, who had watched every cut and heard every scream, celebrated through the night. For them, the death was more than spectacle. It was release. Songs mocking Hugh spread from village to village. Ballads were sung in taverns, laughter echoed in markets, and his name became a curse spat out with hatred. The man who once inspired fear now inspired ridicule. But beneath the noise of celebration lay the silence of power shifting. Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer wasted no time. Within weeks, Edward II was forced to step aside, stripped of his crown. His young son, Edward III, was placed on the throne, though still a boy. Isabella ruled as regent, presenting herself as the savior of a nation freed from tyranny. The story told in court, in church, and across the land was simple. England had been rescued from corruption, from cruelty, from the unnatural influence of a single man. Hugh's death was not described as vengeance. It was described as justice. For the nobles, the fall of Hugh was a windfall. Lands and titles he had stolen were redistributed, handed back to families who had been ruined. Wealth, once locked away under his control, now flowed again through the veins of the kingdom. Families restored their names, lords reclaimed their halls, and the balance of power shifted. Yet this victory carried shadows. For every house raised up again, another was punished for standing at Hugh's side. Those who had profited under his rule were stripped bare, their loyalty to him now a mark of disgrace. The kingdom did not forget who had knelt too eagerly before the favorite. The church too reclaimed its pride. Bishops and abbots who had feared Hugh's grasp now spoke boldly, declaring his fate divine justice. His punishment was retold from pulpits, woven into sermons about pride, lust, and ambition. To the faithful, his castration and disembowelment were not just cruelty but symbols, a warning that sin against God's law, especially sins of corruption and unnatural desire, would end in fire and ruin. For centuries after, his death was remembered not only as treason punished but as a moral lesson clothed in blood. Beyond England's shores, his destruction echoed across Europe. In foreign courts, Hugh's rise and fall became a story whispered by nobles who feared the power of royal favorites in their own lands. Isabella's rebellion became a model, proof that even queens could overthrow tyranny if given the chance. Kings were reminded that too much dependence on a single counselor, too much favoritism, could end in ruin. The image of Hugh's torn body traveled farther than his living influence ever had. Yet not all celebrated. Some chroniclers writing years later wondered if the punishment had been too much. Hugh was guilty, yes, of greed, of cruelty, of corrupting a king. But was any man deserving of such a death? The details of his execution were written with relish, described in more detail than almost any other in medieval history. The careful staging, the humiliation, the mutilation, these revealed not only Hugh's crimes but also his enemies' thirst for vengeance. The scaffold told a story not just of justice, but of rage, and this rage left its own legacy. The method of his death, hanging, disembowelment, quartering, became the standard punishment for treason in England. For centuries after, traitors would face the same ritual, their deaths designed not just to kill but to perform. What Hugh endured became the template for how England displayed its power, how it warned its people, how it burned fear into the hearts of rebels. His death lived on in law as much as in memory, but the deeper legacy was psychological. His rule had shown how easily one man could twist a weak king, how quickly loyalty could become tyranny. His cruelty taught the nobles a bitter truth. Fear can silence, but only for a time. His fall taught them another. When fear breaks, it turns to fury, and fury can topple even the strongest throne. For years afterward, courtiers remembered Hereford whenever they considered rising too high. They remembered the screams, the fire, the crowd cheering as power was torn apart. And they hesitated. Among the people, the story of Hugh became almost myth. He was remembered as the wicked favorite, the man who rose too high and was destroyed for it. Parents whispered his tale to children as a warning against pride. Priests spoke of him as proof that sin devours itself. And yet, in every retelling, the cruelty of his end remained as sharp as the crimes that earned it. His name became a lesson, but also a shadow, a reminder that vengeance can look like justice, and justice can look like cruelty. Centuries later, historians still debated him. Was he the monster described in chronicles, or was he the scapegoat of a kingdom desperate to cleanse itself? Was his death proportionate to his crimes, or was it a spectacle that revealed more about his enemies than about himself? These questions lingered unanswered because his execution had become larger than truth. It was no longer just the end of Hugh Despenser. It was the symbol of unchecked ambition destroyed, of power turned against itself. The people of Hereford eventually returned to their lives. The scaffold was taken down, the square cleaned, the blood washed away by rain. But memory does not wash so easily. The image of Hugh's broken body remained, carried in minds and stories, echoing through time. His downfall was not only his own, it was a mirror held up to all who seek too much power, a warning etched in, pain that civilization and barbarism are separated by a line far thinner than we wish to believe. In the end, Hugh Despenser the Younger left behind no monuments, no heirs of power, no legacy of greatness. What he left was a lesson that fear cannot last forever, that cruelty creates its own grave, and that when ambition blinds a man to everything but his own hunger, his fall will not be quiet. It will be loud, merciless, and remembered for centuries. And so his name, bound forever to the scaffold of Hereford, endures not as a noble, not as a ruler, but as a warning carved into history by blood and fire.